Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Greg Shepherd, but Muslim people like to call me Abdul Azim so they can recognise who I am. I'm originally from Brisbane, Australia, but we've moved around quite a lot. My father was in the Air Force, so we never really stayed in one place for a long, extended period of time. My father became a Catholic when he married my mother, back whenever that was, I think in the 50s sometime. But Mum came from a very religious upbringing. One of her sisters was a Catholic nun for some time, but religion sort of never really played that much of a big part in our life. Yes, we did all of the Catholic rites and so on, you know, the confirmation, the First Communion and things like that. But by the time I was in about, say, grade 3, 4, we just sort of stopped really going to church. We went to Catholic school right up till the end of year 12, so Mum and Dad felt that was important enough that they wanted us to have some kind of spiritual upbringing. But it didn't work in their favour really, because I still remember when I was about 10, 11 years old in grade 5, grade 4 or 5, we were in class, and because we had all of the prayers saying grace and things like that before recess and lunch and things, we were doing that, and I absolutely remember very clearly that all of the kids were doing different ways of praying, you know, in an Islamic context, you know, saying dua, and it just seemed so haphazard and random and disorganised. And I remember clearly thinking to myself, this doesn't make any sense, there can't be any God. So by the time I was 10, 11 years old, I'd become an atheist. So that, plus a number of other experiences at school, you know, the roughness and the inability to explain anything of what we're supposedly believing, just, you know, robotically going through all of the rites without any soul to it at all, meant that I was very detached from it. So later on, by the time I was about 15, or 16 years old, we'd be expected to go to church for Christmas, and you know, dragging me out of the house to go with the family was literally that, dragging me out. And when we'd go down to the churchyard, everybody would go to the go inside the church, but I wouldn't even bother. I'd just stay outside. I was just so averse to the whole concept of believing in God. It just seemed to me so ridiculous because it was disorganised and made no sense. Then, as life continues on, I ended up going to university. I was learning Chinese language and fumbling around in a business course in Victoria College, which later became part of Deakin University in Melbourne. And I was very, very interested in all things Chinese, to the point that in my first year at the university, I was able to come second place in a public speaking competition in Chinese, and because of that I was awarded a scholarship to Beijing. And when I went to study there in the end of 1989, 1990, there were thousands of students from overseas at the Beijing Language Institute, and of course, being from all over the world, it would be highly unlikely that you wouldn't meet people from Muslim countries. At the Chinese New Year, when China basically grinds to a halt, you know, the whole country just stops for Chinese New Year. The only thing that was organised by the university were a couple of trips away from Beijing, and I decided to take the one to a city called Xi'an, which is in central China, simply because it happened to be the cheapest. And on that trip, I met a Syrian fellow by the name of Abdul Rahim. I didn't know in particular that he was Syrian or, you know, he was Arab or whatever. He just happened to, in my eyes, to appear to be like some kind of mafia guy and very dangerous. But as it turns out, he was actually very, very gentle and a sort of caring personality. So the very opposite of all of the physical appearances there. Of course, I'd grown up with the knowledge that all Arabs are dangerous and evil and scary, so I was very wary of him. But our introduction consisted of this: me struggling trying to pick up my bags and get onto a bus in order to go to the hotel, and him grabbing the bags without asking and getting up onto the bus and sitting down, and then me being shocked and thinking, what's happened? I've just lost my bags. But getting up onto the bus and him slapping the seat next to me and saying to me in Chinese, "Zuo, zuo, sit down here." So then we just started chatting, and this almost laughable introduction became the beginning of a very intense friendship, where he would invite me to the dorm room and share stories about his life in China and in Syria, and learning English in Syria but learning Chinese in China. And we talked about world events and things like that at the time, but they weren't very prominent. Gulf War I was raging in full at the time, and so there was a lot of political talk between the Muslims and non-Muslims at the time, but I wasn't part of it. I wasn't in the slightest bit interested. I decided that I'd gone to China to study, not get stuck in world politics. And our friendship grew, even though I'd only known him for about 2 weeks by the time I was leaving China. When I was in the taxi coming back to catch the plane from Beijing to Thailand and then eventually back to Melbourne, I was weeping like a baby because I was going to lose a friend, somebody who I never imagined could even be a friend. And so when I came back to Australia, this personality had put such an impression in my heart that I had to know anything and everything about Arabs. I'm just thinking to myself how the way that Allah works. He wanted to get me to understand about Islam, but he used this inverted commas very sneaky way of getting me to find out about things Arab first. And of course, when you do read things about Arab culture and history, you'd have to be mentally dead to not find out anything out about Islam. So one thing led to another, where I started to read about this person who was called Muhammad alayhi salam. And I was given a book by a friend of mine, and it was written by a British person. They called him Pasha Glub. He was I don't know exactly what his position was, but he was very important in Jordan at some point. It was probably in between the First and Second World War, but I could be wrong. And the book that I read was by him, called The Life and Times of Muhammad, and I was hooked. I couldn't put the book down. It was just such an interesting read, and the entire story was as if I was watching some kind of movie on a screen, where anything and everything just was coming to life before my eyes. And by the end of having read that book, I had no doubt in my mind that this sincere man was a prophet sent by God, even though I was basically still an atheist at the time. I believed in this person, Muhammad. I believed in his message, but I didn't know what the message was. So I decided to start finding out, well, he brought this thing called the Qur'an. What is that? I should actually bother to go and read it. I was hooked again. I just couldn't put this book down. The first thing I did when I woke up was read it. The last thing I was doing when I slept was reading that translation of the Qur'an. I'd read it on the train to university, and when the classes got boring and I was very bored, I'd pick it up and I'd start reading it in class. And some of the people around me must have thought that I'd gone a little bit crazy because they could see that. But there were a couple of points when I was reading this translation that I realised that there was something seriously wrong with my logic, that I could believe in a person who was sent by God but not actually believe in God, that I could really rely on a person called Muhammad and that he was a prophet. But the whole idea of believing in God was so difficult because of the experiences that I had had as a child. But there was one section in the Qur'an which is talking about the story of Noah, where the people around him that he was telling them, you must worship God, their only response was, what the hell are you talking about? These are just crazy stories from the ancient people before us. And I thought, this is exactly what atheists today say. All of these things that are presented to them about God, they just say, it's just crazy stories from the people from ages ago. So how is it that even though Noah was 6,000 years ago, even if it was only 2, human nature hasn't changed a bit? And it made me realise that all of these so-called arguments that atheists use to prove that there is no God make no sense. Allah Ta'ala said it himself in the Qur'an, the truth is from your Lord, Whoever wants to, let him believe. Whoever wants to, let him reject. And so there were these kind of messages that were appealing to my intellect. I thought I was clever and smart and that I'd worked out God, but in fact it was God telling me that, as a matter of fact, you've completely missed the point. Now is the time for you to wake up and realize that this message of Islam is going to actually tell you what you should have been getting when you're in school a long time ago. So I decided that I needed to actually start talking with some Muslims at the university. And I noticed that there was one young lady, and obviously she was a Muslim because she was wearing the hijab, the scarf on her head, but I was a bit ashamed of myself of having to go and talk to a Muslim person about God when for such a long time I'd decided that there was none. And I wanted to ask her questions, but I couldn't think of a way to do so. We were in a class together, and lo and behold, the lecturer decided that we had to have group work. Who was my partner? It was her. So after we finished the assignment, I very shyly asked her, would it be okay if I asked you some questions about Islam? And I was waiting for her to get very angry and slap me across the face and say, how dare you insult me? But as a matter of fact, it was the opposite. And she said, sure, what do you want to know? One thing led to another. I met her father, brother. Her brother-in-law was the son of a prominent imam. And all of my questions that I had were being asked. I was invited to a youth group where we did some reading together. And one of the things that really prompted me to understand that Allah is there and that He's looking after us is a section that this other brother was reading from a book. And I believe I know what the translation of the verses of the Qur'an are for that. Basically, we were sitting in a group, I was listening. And as he was reading, I had a very strange sort of feeling. He was reading a verse, the meaning is something like this, that for the one who does not believe that there is no Lord who, upon who he is relying, he doesn't accept that his Lord is caring for him and protecting him and providing for him. And at that time, the meaning, as it was going past my mind, I felt as if I had been struck by a hammer and that my entire being had been shattered throughout the entire universe. But he kept reading and was saying, but for the one who believes and relies on his Lord, there is a loving, caring Lord who protects and provides for him, shows him the way and guides him. And I felt as if all of the parts of me had just suddenly been flung back together and I was back in my seat. It was that very moment that I decided that I can accept this. I can accept that God is there and that my understanding that I had had before was completely wrong. So much for the attempts that they had to bring me up in their understanding of spirituality. It had actually forced me quite far away from anything of the sort. Later on with that particular youth group, people would be doing things like the Islamic style prayer, where the salah, where you're bowing and prostrating. And the very first time that I saw that, I thought, this is the way that God should be worshipped, not this mumbo-jumbo that I saw when I was in grade 5. So I was attracted to it very quickly, that I understood that this is the correct way of doing things. And it made me realise that the thoughts that I'd had when I was younger, when I'd see things to do with the Jewish religion, that perhaps this is the right way. I had finally found the answer in Islam, that the right way is the way that God gives and has given from the time of Adam to Noah, to Abraham, to Moses, to Jesus and to Muhammad. It's all the same and there is no difference. And so I decided that now it's time for me to come back to the original religion that my soul was yearning for but that I couldn't see. And so I told these young people that I was with that I wanted to accept Islam and that I was ready to do so. But there was a catch. My father had just got his final transfer from Melbourne up here to Brisbane, and so we left. And so I said goodbye to them. I had decided that I wanted to accept Islam, but I hadn't actually done the formal process, though I think in my heart I had decided that that was for me. So we came here to Brisbane, and we went on a holiday after we'd been here in Brisbane for a week or so. We went on a holiday to Caloundra. And during that 2-week period, I read a translation of the Qur'an by Yusuf Ali 3 times in an attempt to really understand what this was all about. But I was intensely lonely. I knew no Muslims at all, and I wanted to find out what Islam actually is. So I finally plucked up the courage to walk from my parents' house to the Holland Park Mosque, And I went inside. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so naturally there was nobody around. And I was very disappointed to find that there was no one there. As I was leaving, someone called me from behind, "What do you want, brother?" And I said, "I want to accept Islam." He said, "Well, come with me." And he introduced me to some other people. We talked about Islam for a while, and I think that they understood that I was ready for this. And then I was introduced to the Imam at the time, Sheikh Abdul Qudus, who I did the Shahada with. And it was a very profound moment in the sense that, I had finally admitted publicly that I wanted to be a Muslim, but it wasn't that profound because I'd already been, if you like, told by Allah Ta'ala that this was the right way, that God had shown me the way to Islam and that I had found the right answer and the right way of life. I wonder whether or not there was a big upheaval in my own family. I never actually came home and said, "Hey Mum, Dad, guess what, I'm a Muslim now." But I would never have done anything like that anyway. But I think that it slowly became very obvious to them, the fact that I had Muslim friends coming over, that I was going out for no particular reason, but they knew I was going to the mosque. And then Ramadan came and then I was fasting. So I give my parents a lot of credit. They aren't blind. They could tell that I'd become a Muslim. But I did have a short conversation with my mother just before I accepted Islam. And the stinging piece of advice that she said to me is that religion and Islam is not a game. Learn about Islam, study Islam properly. Don't be a Muslim one day and then abandon it later. So the only reaction that I ever had from my family was basically, "Good for you." Whether or not they actually like the fact that I have been a Muslim for the last 20 years, they've never said. But they still do see me, I see them, we visit each other regularly, and we love each other very much. But as I said earlier, religion never played much of a part in our life, and it was very obvious that I was an atheist before I'd accepted Islam. So I think they probably found it quite amazing that somebody could go from being an atheist to one of those, inverted commas, fundamentalist types, these Muslims. Islam, for me, though, was the grounding, if you like, coming back to the central point that you are a human being created by God in this gigantic universe, and this is your place, this is your role as a human being. Allah says in the Qur'an that He did not create the humans and the jinn for any other purpose other than to worship Him, to recognize Him and to obey Him. This was the original message, and for those people who do such a thing, then they have the rewards for them in paradise, which no eye has seen, no ear has heard, and has never been imagined by any soul. Not that that is the main focus of why I became a Muslim. The main reason was because it gave me the answers that I didn't have, and was able to pull me out of this almost depressingly drunken stupor of just simply not knowing what on earth is going on and where I am. And I think that is the way that Islam should be viewed, that it is the way to ground you back, to understand who you are according to God, who you are according to humanity, who you are according to your family and to your community. And I think that this is one of the best messages that people in today's times need. We need to understand our relationship to other people and to our Creator, and then we will be able to become truly at peace with ourselves by submitting in Islam to Allah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.